The sun pushed through the last traces of dawn, casting a soft glow over Boulder's quiet streets. It was the kind of morning that settled into routine without announcement. Shopkeepers unlocking their doors, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the corner bakery, and families making their way to church, exchanging nods and warm smiles as they passed familiar faces. The town thrived on these moments, the unspoken comfort of knowing what to expect. Inside the white steepled church, voices swelled in low conversation. Coats were draped over pews, children fidgeted beneath their parents' watchful eyes, and the hum of the organ signaled that service was about to begin. At the center of it all was Pastor James Mitchell, a man who had long been the town's anchor. He wasn't just their pastor. He was the one who visited the sick, counseled the struggling, and delivered sermons that felt less like doctrine and more like personal conversations with an old friend. His presence in the pulpit was as steady as the town itself. The organist played the first notes of a hymn, a cue that settled the congregation into quiet anticipation. But when the minutes stretched and the pulpit remained empty, an uneasy murmur rippled through the room. Pastor Mitchell was never late. A deacon exchanged glances with the choir director before slipping toward the hallway that led to the pastor's study. Others craned their necks, expecting him to emerge with an apologetic smile and some simple explanation. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence, the kind that swallows a room whole. The deacon, a man who had known Mitchell for decades, stood frozen in the doorway. A moment later, a sharp gasp broke the hush, followed by the hurried shuffle of footsteps. The congregation, now standing, strained to see beyond the threshold, their faces shifting from curiosity to confusion to something much worse. In the pastor's study, the desk was still cluttered with notes for the morning sermon, a cup of tea cooling beside them. The chair was overturned, and there, against the backdrop of bookshelves lined with scripture, lay Pastor Mitchell motionless. The life that had once filled every corner of this town was gone from his eyes. Shock didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, slow and unwelcome, as those nearest the door took a step back, then another. Whispers turned into gasps. A woman clutched her husband's arm. The organist, unaware, continued playing until someone finally had the presence of mind to stop her. Outside, the world carried on. Birds flitted between trees, the bakery continued selling warm loaves, and cars passed through town without knowing that. Inside that church, something had shifted. The predictability of the morning had been shattered, and in its place, something else had settled a silence that would not leave. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Officer Karen Davis had done hundreds of traffic stops in her career, enough to recognize when something was off. She had spotted the car a few minutes earlier, black sedan, slightly tinted windows, moving just under the speed limit. Too careful. The plates weren't flagged, but something about it made her watch a little longer. Flipping on her lights, she pulled the vehicle over to the side of the road. Standard protocol. She approached with her hand near her holster, not out of fear but habit. The driver had already rolled down the window before she reached the side. He was breathing too fast. His hands gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles had gone pale. License and registration. Her voice was even calm. The man hesitated before reaching into the glove box. His fingers trembled as he pulled out the documents. A bad liar wouldn't make eye contact. This one made too much. His stare was rigid, unnatural, like he was measuring her reactions. And then there was the man in the passenger seat. Older, well-dressed. Still, something about him was different. Unlike the driver, he wasn't afraid, just resigned. She glanced at the name on the ID. Samuel Green, pastor. Her radio crackled, and a voice came through. A bolo had just been issued for a suspect connected to a recent murder. Male, mid-40s, last seen driving a black sedan. The same black sedan sitting in front of her. Everything happened in seconds. The driver's hand moved too fast toward his pocket. Davis stepped back, hand already on her weapon. Don't, but he did. Gunfire exploded into the quiet night. One shot, then another. A flash of movement as the driver bolted out of the car and disappeared into the darkness. Inside the vehicle, Pastor Samuel Green's body slumped forward, the white collar of his shirt soaked red. His lips moved, as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. Backup arrived minutes later, sirens breaking the eerie silence that followed. But the driver was gone, vanished into the night. By the time detectives arrived, one thing was clear: this was no random shooting. And it wasn't just a simple traffic stop gone wrong. What should have been a routine traffic stop quickly spirals into chaos. But as we learn more about this unsettling turn of events, ask yourself, how often do we overlook the quiet moments before everything changes? Stay with us, this case is only beginning to reveal its shocking connections. If you're following along, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more updates as this mystery continues to unfold.
The neighborhood had always been the kind people moved to for a sense of security. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, porch lights glowing just bright enough to feel inviting but not intrusive. That illusion shattered the moment police arrived at the home of Pastor David Lee. It was a delivery driver who found him. He had knocked twice, waited, then knocked again. The house was silent, too silent for a man who was usually up before dawn. The door, slightly ajar, creaked open with the wind. One cautious step inside, and the smell hit him first. Metallic, heavy, wrong. By the time officers arrived, neighbors had already gathered on the sidewalks, whispering in hushed tones, eyes darting toward one another. Doors locked, blinds drawn. Things like this weren't supposed to happen here. The crime scene felt disturbingly familiar. No sign of forced entry. The house undisturbed, except for the body. Pastor Lee lay slumped over his desk, his hands resting on the open pages of his Bible. A single gunshot wound, execution style, just like the others. Detectives worked quickly, scanning every inch for clues, but it was clear, whoever did this knew what they were doing. No fingerprints, no signs of a struggle. Just the same calculated precision seen in the deaths of Pastor Mitchell and Pastor Green. Word spread fast. By the afternoon, news vans lined the street, reporters standing in front of their cameras, piecing together a narrative the police were still struggling to understand. 3 pastors, 3 different cities, the same method. The community's reaction was immediate. Church doors that were once always open now locked before sunset. Town meetings overflowed with anxious residents demanding answers. Fear settled over Fort Collins like a thick fog, unshakable, suffocating. Parishioners who once sought comfort in their places of worship now sat in pews with unease, eyes scanning for anything or anyone who didn't belong. Some whispered that the murders had to mean something, that the pastors were targeted for reasons beyond random violence. Others looked over their shoulders, wondering if their own church leaders were next. Investigators dug deeper into the victims' lives. 3 men of faith, deeply involved in their communities. Pastor Mitchell, known for his outreach programs helping former inmates rebuild their lives. Pastor Green, an advocate for the homeless, constantly pushing city officials for better shelters. Pastor Lee, who worked closely with troubled youth, always urging them to turn away from crime before it was too late. What connected them beyond their calling? That was the question keeping detectives awake at night. The investigation, until this point, had been full of questions that led nowhere. The 3 pastors, each of them seemingly targeted without reason, without connection to one another. But detectives, relentless in their pursuit of the truth, started to piece together fragments. Small, seemingly insignificant pieces that began to form a clearer image. A breakthrough came from an unlikely place. The footage from a gas station security camera, a routine clip that had been overlooked. There, in the flickering light, a woman appeared briefly in the reflection of a car's side mirror. Her movements were quick, almost methodical. She wasn't driving, but she was there. This was the first solid lead that broke through the fog. With this single moment, a shift occurred. As forensic experts analyzed the crime scenes once again, a discovery was made. Fibers that seemed out of place at first glance. They were fine, synthetic, but not commonly found in public clothing. These fibers led them to something they had missed before. The fibers were traced back to a specific jacket given to residents at a mental health facility in Denver. It didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots. Records from that institution revealed the name Jane Doe, a file buried among hundreds, but the details stood out. Jane had spent years in psychiatric care after a troubled childhood filled with instability, trauma, and neglect. She had been placed in foster care as a child, where reports suggested a long history of mistreatment at the hands of so-called religious figures. Over the years, Jane had grown bitter, her distrust of authority figures festering, until it became something else entirely. A belief that the pastors she targeted weren't just men of faith but frauds. Her hatred had crystallized over time, and it seemed she'd taken her mission into her own hands, finding the men she believed embodied everything that had been done wrong to her, and bringing her vendetta to life. The more the detectives uncovered, the clearer it became that Jane had methodically chosen each victim, stalking them, studying their every move. The murders were not spontaneous. They were deliberate acts, each executed with chilling precision. Now Jane was gone. Her face flashed across the screens of every news outlet in the state. Law enforcement had no choice but to launch a manhunt. Every available officer, every resource was devoted to tracking her down. But Jane was skilled at staying out of sight. She had spent years hiding in plain sight, and now, with the full attention of the public on her, she remained elusive. The media, desperate for answers, spun theories that only fed the growing paranoia. Was she a victim? Was she simply lashing out at the world that had failed her? Or was she something darker? As the fear and anxiety spread through the community, there was a palpable sense that Jane was always one step ahead. She'd made her move, and the entire state now waited for her next. What happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about this case. Like this video and subscribe to ensure you don't miss any critical updates as we get closer to the shocking truth. The manhunt for Jane Doe had dragged on for weeks, each day marked by a growing sense of dread. Authorities had scoured towns, checked remote areas, and followed every lead. But it wasn't until a tip came in from a hiker, an unexpected call, that they finally zeroed in on her location. She had found refuge, of all places, in a small, secluded cabin nestled high in the Rocky Mountains, far from civilization. Law enforcement, aware that this would be a tense and unpredictable moment, approached cautiously. Officers prepared for the worst. They were dealing with a woman who had shown a shocking level of precision and control in her actions. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a dangerous standoff with someone who had already proven that she was willing to do whatever it took to avoid capture. When they finally surrounded the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Officers made contact, but there was no response, only silence. Every inch of the terrain was scrutinized, every angle covered. The longer the silence dragged on, the more the pressure built. Was she inside? Was she armed? The tension was unbearable, each moment dragging by as the officers cautiously approached. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden movement broke the stillness, a flash of motion from within. Jane was there, standing at the doorway, her face calm but betraying the inner chaos she had been carrying for years. The standoff lasted for what seemed like hours. Authorities attempted to reason with her, but Jane remained distant, her eyes never quite meeting theirs, as if she had already detached herself from the world around her. It was a calculated moment, a standoff that felt like the climax of a long, drawn-out battle between her and the world she had rejected. Finally, when all avenues of negotiation had been exhausted, law enforcement made their move. Officers moved in swiftly, subduing Jane with precision. The standoff was over, and with it, the haunting trail of death she had left behind. But Jane's capture was only the beginning of the truth coming to light. During her interrogation, detectives were prepared for the usual evasion and deflection. Instead, Jane spoke freely, revealing an unfiltered account of the pain and betrayal she had suffered at the hands of religious institutions. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of years of unresolved trauma. Her story was one of a broken childhood, of growing up in a system that promised salvation but delivered only suffering. She had been placed in a religious foster care system that claimed to offer refuge, but instead subjected her to unspeakable abuse. The very institutions meant to heal her had, in her eyes, been the source of her torment. Her belief was that the pastors she targeted represented everything that had destroyed her life. It wasn't vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was an attempt to reclaim control, to confront the men who symbolized the oppressive forces she had come to despise. She wasn't merely a killer. She was a person trying to right a wrong, though in the most destructive way possible. As Jane's trial approached, the nation was captivated. News outlets covered every detail, every twist in the case. The courtroom was filled with a sense of inevitability. This would be more than just a trial. It would be a reckoning for the damage done, not only by Jane but by the very systems that had shaped her fate. Prosecutors, armed with a mountain of evidence, painted a damning portrait of Jane's actions. Surveillance footage, forensic data, and testimonies from witnesses who had been close to the pastors all pointed to the same chilling conclusion. Jane had meticulously planned and executed each murder with cold precision. But the defense was determined to shift the focus. They delved deep into Jane's troubled history, portraying her as a victim of a broken system, one that had failed her at every turn. They argued that her traumatic experiences, her history of abuse, manipulation, and neglect, had led her down a dark path. She wasn't born a killer. She had been shaped by the circumstances of her life. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that the case was not as simple as it seemed. Was Jane simply a product of her environment, a woman driven to violence by forces beyond her control? Or was she a cold-blooded killer who had used her past as an excuse for her actions? After the trial concluded, the community was left to process the finality of the verdict. Jane Doe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a moment that marked the end of the legal proceedings, but for many, it was only the beginning of a much longer journey, the slow, difficult path of healing. In the days that followed, the towns of Boulder, Colorado Springs, and Fort Collins found themselves gathering in quiet places, coming together to remember the lives of the pastors who had been taken. They weren't just religious figures to their congregations, they were fathers, husbands, mentors. The loss felt personal for so many, and the grieving process was as much about finding comfort in each other as it was about reflecting on the gap left behind. Memorials and services became a way to mark their absence, but they also became a symbol of resilience. Life, however fragile, pressed on. It wasn't just the communities that were affected by the killings. There was a collective sense of confusion and anger. How could someone be driven to take such extreme actions? The horror of the pastors' deaths prompted many to question how religious institutions functioned. Were they places of safety, or did they sometimes unknowingly foster environments that allowed trauma to fester unnoticed? These weren't easy questions, and for many, they were questions that carried a sense of discomfort. In the aftermath, conversations about mental health began to rise to the surface. It wasn't only about the loss of life, but about understanding what led to such an event in the first place. People began to wonder if Jane's actions could have been prevented with better support, more attention to those struggling with emotional and psychological trauma. The church, which had been a place of solace for so many, also became the site of difficult conversations. Could more have been done to prevent Jane from reaching a breaking point? Should there have been better mechanisms in place to address underlying issues before they became irreparably damaging? As communities began to heal, they also began to discuss the complexities of forgiveness. The impact of trauma was not only felt by the victims and their families but extended to the larger community. No one was left unchanged. But there was also a collective awareness that healing would take time and couldn't happen until everyone, each individual, was willing to face the uncomfortable truths about what had unfolded. Looking ahead, it became evident that society needed to shift its focus. Understanding that crimes like Jane's were often rooted in deeper societal issues was crucial to preventing future tragedies. What happened in these towns wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a consequence of systemic failures. Addressing those issues meant rethinking how communities functioned, how institutions interacted with individuals, and how everyone, from church leaders to local officials, needed to step up. Even as the years passed and the case faded from headlines, the discussions started by these tragic events didn't go away. The incidents sparked conversations in churches, mental health forums, and even local government meetings. What could be done to change the way mental health is addressed in the community? How could people suffering in silence find a way to be heard? The process of healing, both for the towns affected and the wider community, was about creating awareness and encouraging the kind of dialogue that could help prevent future pain. As the story of Jane Doe and the pastors became part of history, it reminded everyone of the importance of compassion. The crime and the aftermath shed light on how essential it is for society to not just look at what happens after tragedy strikes, but to look before, to understand the warning signs and offer help where it's needed. It wasn't an easy chapter for any of them, but it was a chapter that forced communities to question, to reflect, and to ultimately make a commitment. A commitment to never let such pain go unnoticed again. The trial is over, but the ripple effects of Jane's actions are still being felt. As the communities begin the long process of healing, we must ask ourselves, what can we learn from this tragedy? Lessons that could help prevent future tragedies and heal communities torn apart by violence. If this case has made you think, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video so others can reflect on the importance of healing and understanding.